Have you ever wondered how everyone, governments, corporations, small businesses, families, can all be in debt at the same time and for such astronomical amounts?
In the early 60s, a Georgetown University professor collects information for a book favorable to the network of powerful men who founded the CFR. For 2 years, Professor Carroll Quigley is allowed to examine the confidential papers and secret records of this network. Quigley reveals that these men aim to create a world system of financial control in private hands, able to dominate the political system of each country and the economy of the world as a whole. In short, they seek total and quiet control of the entire world
by bankrupting their own businesses. The Illuminati owns most, I would say 99 9/10 of the stores that you walk into and shop and gas stations you go to. And they are going to destroy them on purpose. And the idea of taking over is to bankrupt the whole world where nothing is of any value and the currency does not exist anywhere, and then come back and solve all the problems.
In 1866, there was $1.8 billion in currency in circulation in the United States, about $50.46 per capita. In 1867 alone, $500 million was removed from the U.S. money supply. 10 years later, in 1876, America's money supply was reduced to only $600 million. In other words, 2/3 of America's money had been called in by the bankers. Incredibly, only $14.60 per capita remained in circulation. What's so important about how money was withdrawn from the U.S. money supply? Because this is the real cause of depressions, deliberate manipulations of the money supply by big bankers to get what they want. In other words, by January of 2009, the world's money supply had been contracted more than that which caused the Great Depression in America in the 1930s. Some believe the economic crisis that began in 2008 is still being completely manipulated by the big banks. But it is more likely that their debt money system has finally spiraled out of even their control. In 2008 and 2009, nations poured unprecedented money into the system to prevent its collapse. At the very least, unprecedented inflation will surely follow.
What happened?
I think you're in a liquidation phase. I think Kirsten had it exactly right. I think there's a bunch of wrong-footed moves by Hank Paulson and the Illuminati of the country, if you will, and I think we're paying for it right now.
The problem is that since 1864, we've had a debt-based banking system. All our money is based on government debt. We cannot extinguish government debt without extinguishing our money supply. That's why talk of paying off the national debt without reforming our banking system is an impossibility. That's why the solution does not lie in discussing the size of the national debt, rather it lies in reforming our banking system. This is the Federal Reserve headquarters in Washington. The truth is that the Federal Reserve is a private bank owned by private stockholders and run purely for their private profit.
Mainstream media have blamed our financial crisis on the recent administration or poor decisions made on Wall Street. This crisis, however, is not about politics. The Republican and Democratic parties are both corrupt. The crisis was created by the real power that controls our country through these two parties, the Federal Reserve. The Federal Reserve is a private bank whose owners are primarily European. Who does own the Federal Reserve banks? Numerous private banking companies, such as the Rothschild Bank of London, Warburg Bank of Hamburg, Rothschild Bank of Berlin, and Lazard Brothers of Paris, just to name a few.
A lot of people think that the Federal Reserve is already part of the government. They're not. It's controlled by cliques of unelected, unaccountable bankers meeting in secret. Most of these people have never even been through the formality of a Senate hearing or a Senate confirmation. They claim that they're part of the U.S. government. They masquerade as if they were part of the U.S. government. But in reality, this is a purely private operation. Jackals, hyenas, raptors, all of them loyal, not to the American people, but to the Wall Street banks, which is where most of them come from.
You must understand that every penny, every dollar we have in circulation is created as an interest-bearing debt.
So what is the national debt? When government spends more than it collects in taxes, it has to borrow the difference by selling interest-bearing IOUs, such as U.S. bonds. When a U.S. bank buys a $100 U.S. bond, it gets to loan out 10 times that amount. So the bank not only gets back the $100 plus interest from the federal government, it gets to loan out another $1,000 it doesn't have and charge additional interest. Banks are allowed to create this extra money out of thin air. That's why bank buildings are the biggest in every town on the planet. This system of lending way more than you have is called fractional reserve lending. Almost all our money is created by banks, lending it to people, to companies, or to government. As we'll see, there is a better way for a government to get money. Simply issue it without debt for the benefit of all citizens.
A government agency of some kind should take charge of the money supply.
But that's not the way it is now in Great Britain.
No, not in any country. It's almost all over the world. The bulk of the money supply is now created by commercial banks as debt.
Given U.S. exposure in banks and money market accounts to Europe, do you have any concern that the turbulence from a financial crisis in Europe could trigger a double-dip recession here at home?
I do have concerns about the European situation, but in terms of the exposure, as you say, our loan, first of all, is really, it's not a loan, it's a swap, because what we're doing is we're swapping dollars for euros with the European Central Bank. We have a contract with the European Central Bank that they will return to us the full amount of dollars plus interest that we give them. So we do not face any exchange rate risk or any interest rate risk. Moreover, they make the loans to their own banks about which they have appropriate information, supervisory information and the like, and if there are any losses, they are responsible, not us.
I secured a provision in Dodd-Frank, which you were not too enthusiastic about, as I recall, which allowed for an audit of the Fed during the financial crisis. And what we learned is that the Fed provided, in a revolving way, some $16 trillion in low-interest loans to every financial institution in this country, many of the central banks throughout the world. Why aren't we doing the same, providing low-interest loans to small businesses so that they can create jobs? In other words, if you, during the financial crisis, provided $16 trillion to banks all over this world, why are you not providing the kinds of money that small businesses now desperately need so they can expand and create jobs?
We're going from 10 up to 105. So that's $105 billion we're going to commit to bailing out the various countries of the world. Who pays for this? Where does it come from? Will this all come out of the printing press once again, and we are expected to bail out the world?
Well, the source of this was going back in the G20 meetings in the crisis, and I think one of the agreements that the G20 leaders came up with was sort of mutual commitment to put more money into the IMF as a way of addressing the financial crisis around the world.
So you can do anything you want. You can create as much money as you want. So
you can see any transaction or loan we make, we're happy to provide that information to you.
Where would the money come from?
It would come, it's a loan, but it would come from the U.S. government.
Eventually we would create out of thin air.
United States Treasury Secretary Timothy Geithner has joined European finance ministers and the heads of central banks in Poland to discuss Europe's growing debt crisis. The meetings, to be held over 2 days, follow a coordinated move by the world's central banks to pump US dollars into the European banking system. It means that cash-strapped commercial banks will have access to unlimited amounts of dollars until the end of the year, as troubled nations like Greece and Italy try to stabilise their debt-laden economies.
The Bronze, 1 minute.
Thank you, Mr. President. The rapporteur, Mr. Scicluna, said that the ECB had tried to expand liquidity, but that liquidity had not been passed on by the banks to their customers. Well, that's true outside the Eurozone as well as inside it. My party is pleased that the UK remains outside the Eurozone. A state's currency must reflect the condition and needs of its own economy and not the average needs of 27 different economies. However, keeping our own currency is only part of the answer. The central problem is that credit creation and distribution is in the hands of private companies, the commercial banks, and that's true outside as well as inside the Eurozone. The function of credit creation, in effect money creation, must be removed from the hands of private companies. Extra spending power when it's needed, either to distribute existing or imminent growth, or needed to finance large infrastructure projects, must be created by the government and spent into circulation, and not created by the banks and lent into circulation. Thank you.
Author, researcher. He has, of course, degrees in history and economics. And so now our interview, in depth, never before seen, with Webster Griffin Tarpley.
In the autumn of 2009, we've had some important international financial meetings. We've had the Group of 20 meeting in Pittsburgh, and we've had the Istanbul annual meeting of the International Monetary Fund. And out of this emerges, I think, a political project of the US, British oligarchs, joined by the European Central Bank and their followers in Japan, which comes down to this. The International Monetary Fund will be made into the center of a world economic dictatorship. The way they want to do this is to make the IMF the central bank of all central banks. So we have the Federal Reserve, bad enough, European Central Bank, extremely bad, Bank of Japan, also bad, but above them, yet another layer of oligarchical power plastered on top of the Fed, the European Central Bank, and the Bank of Japan is the IMF, with regulatory capabilities, but also as a lender of last resort to the national central bank. If the IMF gets on your case, you are required to sign a letter of intent in which you express your commitment to observe the conditionalities of the IMF. And they have a very specific economic doctrine. It's called the Washington Consensus, and that is deregulation, privatization, the destruction of your social safety net. It would mean union busting. If you have a state sector, they want to destroy that. They want to have the race to the bottom across the board. The currency for the new world finance dictatorship is already there. It's special drawing rights, SDR. So they're hoping to stock up on $1 trillion total in various currencies and use that as reserves to back up the special drawing rights. Now, there's nothing worse than this. The mentality of this IMF is called the Washington Consensus. They have no success stories to point to. They always fail. They always increase poverty, increase economic backwardness, shut down industries, increase unemployment, and so on down the line. From Bolivia to Poland to Russia in the 1990s. IMF shock therapy is widely regarded as economic death.
And radio host Alex Jones believes that the Greek debt crisis has been engineered by predatory financiers looking to make big bucks at the expense of poorer nations.
You have these global interests moving around the world like a group of vultures, basically plucking the eyes out of once free nations. They have the government invest taxpayer money, in some cases trillions of dollars, with them buying derivatives, buying financial instruments that they know are fraudulent. And on the way up, the big private central banks that are privately owned make trillions of dollars and then invest that in real assets. Then on the way down, when the nations start going bankrupt, the banks come back in with supposed bailout money and then offer to give people basically 30% interest on more money. And so what's happening is Europe wants Greece to fully go under. They want their islands, they want their infrastructure, they want full control over their country. They are in trouble because the population more than ever realize that the private banking cartels are nothing but Ponzi scheme criminals, and more people are identifying them. And so there's a real battle going on globally against these oligarchs.
The reality is that all currencies in the world are printed by central private banks, owned by the Illuminati, high-level Freemasons. They have no legal authority to print money. If Manchester United was printing money, would you consider their money to be credible? Just because private banks do it, we consider the money as credible. This is madness. They print money out of thin air, thus, the debts around the world are illegal. What we must do: each nation must have its own currency. Nationalize the private, national banks, and all the utilities, water, power, etc., necessary for the well-being of the citizens. Dissolve the World Trade Organization. Countries must be independent. prefer local products.